But this kind of is summing up our entire month of August with what we're going to talk about tonight. Hopefully it's going to kind of bring a lot of different things we talked about together, and we're going to bring it home here to the Southern Appalachians and talk about how a lot of that has come to be. So I did title tonight's class an Appalachian Herbal, and some of you may remember from some other classes I've talked about what an herbal actually is, because often we'll hear that used as an adjective before tea or concoction or remedy or something like that. But a true herbal is an ancient manual that helps us facilitate the idea of plants for medicinal purposes. But for tonight, we're going to go a little bit deeper and kind of check into how all that knowledge came to be and why it is so important. So as always, before we move on, if you have comments or questions or anything like that, make sure you put them in the comments, and I'll share those if we've got some cool things, especially as we move through tonight. There may be some things that y'all want to add from a personal perspective. And y'all know I love getting that because we're all learning from one another. So there may be some things I've not covered tonight that you might know about. And I'm always looking for other things to kind of explore and share with the whole group too. So make sure you do that. But as far as setting kind of where the framework goes for this evening, it's basically just looking at a huge influence in our area. And of course, Native Americans wandered this, this area, this region for years before the white man came from Europe and all points across the Atlantic and everything. But I kind of wanted to hone in more specifically on the Cherokee Reservation, and even more specific, the eastern band of the Cherokee Indians and the Qualla boundary, which is over in North Carolina there on the Haywood, Swain County line, not far from Fontana Lake. And it does kind of almost straddle, as you can see there, into the Great Smoky Mountains. So it's real close to going into Gatlinburg. But if you remember from some of our other classes, we have talked about the influence of Native Americans, especially when those first settlers, especially the Scotch Irish, first started arriving in the area. And that's kind of where we're going to spend a little time tonight and try to see how the Cherokee Nation or the Native American populations all over the U.S. really directly influenced our view and the use of native plants here in the region. So to kind of do that, we take a look at who they deemed essential in their tribes. And that was, of course, medicine men and healers. They were really essential components of the Cherokee society. They helped promote cohesion and unity within the people and the natural world around them. So this Native American healer, one like you see pictured here, he would be very familiar with what you see there in the background. All plants, flora and fauna, in the Appalachian forest. And, the tribes actually entrusted him with all of that knowledge and entrusted them with, all the people in their tribe to be able to know how to utilize those plants, how to make those relationships. They knew what was poisonous or toxic, kind of like we talked about last week, versus those that were very useful and what specifically they were utilized for. So we know that it was those Native Americans that pretty much helped pave the way for the early settlers and to the mountain areas, and kind of, for lack of a better analogy, kind of held our hand and helped really show us the value of a lot of these plants. Even though they too, those early settlers, were bringing plants from the old world, and we'll talk about some of those relationships, but it was truly the Native Americans that even helped extend that knowledge that they of those plants that they brought with them. Just as a reminder, 2000, we know that there's about 2,000 species of just Appalachian flora, and we know that about 200 of those species are wholly confined to the Southern Appalachians. Now, why that's so important is because we are a very biodiverse and rich area in regards to all that plant fauna or plant biodiversity. So that was another critical issue. I mean, we had plants available here in these mountains that you don't find even today, that we won't find just anywhere else that we wander and roam. Just again, to help set the stage a little bit, to kind of prepare us, when we do talk about the Cherokee Nation, they believed in direction. And this really does kind of set the stage as far as plants, because some of these things actually directly correlated, or the plants that we're going to talk about correlated with direction. So we know that east was the sun and represented good spirits. So they would pray to the east in order to remove witchcraft and any type of disease that might have afflicted them or any member of their tribe. To the north was where the blue man resided, and they considered that the home of winter. So that was the direction they would pray to when they were looking for any type of healing for burns. And then the blue man also represented winter and any disease that was associated with winter. And then to the south, they had the red man. And the red man was the aid for frostbite and any other winter-related ailment. So there's a little bit of difference there from the north and the south, because in the north, we were looking at winter diseases. In the south, it was more about winter-related ailments. So think about frostbite. And then to the west, this is where the black man or the purple man resided. And he was known as death. And you can probably see from that representation there. So in their belief, they actually thought the devil himself or some spirit could always be awaiting at the crossroads. And then we also talk about a clock, and you can kind of see how the clock is running there. And the reason for that is because time basically never stands still. We're always moving with the sun, because that's the way that we grow and prosper. And then if we go counterclockwise, then that means we're actually helping something to diminish or reverse itself. So think about rubbing a wound counterclockwise. You want to help make that better. Or if in the instance of a snake bite, when you rub counterclockwise, that actually represented uncoiling that serpent, and it would help eradicate the toxin. Now, what this symbol here represents, many of you are probably familiar with, that symbolizes east, and we still see that on maps today. And remember, east is very important, because remember, that's where the natives are praying to, probably more so than any other direction on a very regular basis. But just to kind of tie that in with Christianity, we know that you're buried facing east, like you can see here in the cemetery. And then baptisms actually took place in the rivers that were facing east. And then when we talk about dowsing for water, this also goes back to direction. They would start in the east and turn counterclockwise when dowsing for water, to be able to find that and make use of that. Another component with what these Native Americans believed is just living in harmony with nature. So when we look at some of their written word, we see that the old ones say that at one time, all of creation spoke the same language. And y'all have probably heard this before. So in essence, what that means is that plants, they could communicate with the finned ones, or the fish. And then any of our four-legged creatures, they could talk with the trees. And then we have, let's see, where's my picture? Stones that would actually talk with the wind. But in all of this, we know that man was the one that kind of disrupted this cycle. Okay, so at this time, again, remember, everybody and all things could actually communicate with one another. So the plants, the animals, the elements, the four directions, all of this existence, they knew that if the two-leggeds, like you see pictured here, were to survive, that they were going to need help. And the animals were kind of what started this. They gave themselves willingly, sacrificing themselves so that we could have food, clothing, and shelter. And you can kind of see there an agreement was forged that the two-leggeds, which are us, would ask permission for these gifts. They would give thanks for that sacrifice, and then they would take no more than they needed. And so it was good. So you have the plant people, the standing people, which were the trees, and the stone people, which were the rocks. They were freely given of themselves so that we humans had everything we needed, specifically food, clothing, and shelter. But as the story goes, and again, just kind of setting the stage for where we're going tonight, we two-leggeds, we started growing in numbers, and then kind of got to feeling like we were on a pedestal, a little bit more important than the rest of creation. So we began to believe that this here, which is a representation of the web of life, revolved around us. ignored the fact that we was just a small part of the circle. And so that was when the two-leggeds began to kill without asking permission. They began to take more than what was needed and ceased to give thanks. So then at that point, all things were not good, and that agreement was broken. So it was at this time that the great animal councils, they came together. They wanted to determine what they could do to right these wrongs. They knew they needed to be able to protect themselves from destruction and eradication. And so it was decreed by the council, if one of their clan was killed by the two-leggeds and there was no thanksgiving for that sacrifice, then that chief animal spirit would afflict some kind of disrespectful, devastating disease that they didn't think that the two-legged could bounce back from. But from there, we bring the plants in. So they were pretty distressed too. And they told the animals, hey, you know what? We've been wrong too. They dig us up. They walk all over us. They burn us out. They don't listen to us when we try to tell them what we can do to help them. And that's kind of the whole focus for this evening. Because it was the plants that pretty much felt compassion for the two-legged creatures. And during this time, and according to Cherokee legend, it was man that really struggled to realize his place in the web of creation. And he couldn't learn if he was wiped out by any kind of disease. So the plants knew that man needed their help in order to sustain themselves. So they told the council of the animals, for any disease that you give them, we the plant people, we're going to give them a cure. All that the two-leggeds have to do is just listen when we talk to them. So that kind of brings us where we're coming tonight. I've got two slides out of order. I just now saw that. But I want you to think about how we do kind of come full circle. And I'm going to explain to you what some of this terminology means here. But just kind of remember that story for the next slide. But when we look at this circle of medicine and kind of how we've came from where we were at from this Native American belief system, and even before that, like you can see here before Christ, even in foreign lands before anybody came here, in 2000 BC, we were saying, here, eat this root. But by 1000 AD, we're saying, hey, that root is heathen, say this prayer instead. And then we get around to 1500, and by then it's being said that prayer is superstition. You've got to drink this potion. And so it goes. By 1940, the potion snake oil. So here now you got to swallow this pill. It'll cure all your ailments. By 1985, that pill's ineffective. So now we got to take this antibiotic. And then kind of look at where we're at in modern day. That antibiotic doesn't work anymore. So here, eat this root. So from that legend and the belief system of the Native Americans and kind of bringing all this culmination of cultures together, and we talked about that, we get this, what we call the Doctrine of Signatures. And many of you have probably heard of this before. But what the Doctrine of Signatures is, it's a signature. It's really an intricate system of winks and nods from Mother Nature herself. So if you look at it, the word signature actually is sign in nature kind of put together. And then in the Cherokee language, this word here, I'm not going to try to say that word, but that actually means Doctrine of Signatures in their native language. And so what that basically is reading the signs of nature. And there was no one culture that was better at it really than the Native Americans, even though it wasn't something they technically termed. It was something they had been doing for years. So again, kind of remember, we've got the Native Americans here. We start coming from the old world, the Scotch, Irish, the Germans, everybody else. You get a lot of Spanish and French influence. We have the Moors from West Africa coming in, bringing a lot of the spiritual belief and a lot of that folklore magic. So all of this is coming together. And so with this is kind of where we get that sharing of knowledge. And when we talk about reading the signs of nature, that's people using that plant's appearance to divine its medicinal properties. So this is where Doctrine of Signatures comes from. And it says that if a plant or any feature of that plant resembles in some way a condition or any body part, then that plant can treat that, or that specific plant part can treat that ailment, in essence. But kind of where this came from is this fella here. He's a Greek physician. I can't say his name either. You can see this right here. He also wrote the Materia Medica, which is a pretty common herbal that's still utilized today. But basically, he was the one that first assigned a signature in the year 65. And that was based on clues that the plant themselves gave him. And again, it was the concept that a plant resembles the condition or the body part that it could heal. So his belief was that God marked objects with signs or signatures of their specific person. So the notion was a divine design as a central aspect of the medical doctrine throughout the Middle Ages. And this is what really carried over and came over even all those years later with the first settlers to America. So one way to kind of simply illustrate this before we get into more of the plants is a carrot. So when we look at some of these life-changing intricacies of nature and look at what the design that it's left just in its clue that it's left for us just based on its design, the carrot's a really good one to look at. So growing up, and you yourself have probably told kids and grandchildren, eat your carrots because it's good for your eyesight, right? And we've always heard that. Well, they are good for our eyes. I can't talk tonight, y'all, because they're high in vitamin A, and that's an essential nutrient for healthy eyes. But if you slice a carrot, like you see here, and look at its core, what does that look like? It's really kind of cool how it looks like an eye. So the core of the carrot actually looks like the eye. You look like you've got some veins in here as well. And this is just nature basically leaving that sign. It's going to be beneficial to the body part for which it resembles. To take that back a little bit further, you've got Queen Anne's lace. And we know that's Queen Anne's lace because that legend, she was embroidering, pricked her finger on a needle, and the blood dropped on her lace. So hence the Queen Anne's lace. But Queen Anne's lace is a member of the carrot family. And so the first carrots were not orange. It was through natural selection that we made them that way over years and years. But Queen Anne's lace is in the wild carrot. It is wild carrot. That's what it's called. And that's going to be one of the first carrots that our Native Americans had to eat. Now, notice this one is not one that we're going to have here, but I thought this was a really good one to illustrate kind of what I mean by this. The herb Scorpius, which is what you see here, and it's actually a Phacelia species. It resembles the tail of a scorpion, and so it's good against its biting. That's kind of how this intricate web of networking actually works. So basically, in a nutshell, it's just divinity via the plants. And again, it was in medieval Europe that physicians were naming this doctrine, and they developed it further, and they believed that God actually included those signatures. So again, you're seeing this huge immersion of all these cultures. It wasn't just strictly Christianity. It wasn't Native America. I mean, you had all kinds of different religious cultures, ethnicities coming together and actually believing in the doctrine. Even though you see there, every era, there were skeptics. And just as an FYI, when we think about herbalist or botanist, and that word was, botanists back in the day were actually herbalists, they were among those first ones that were persecuted. And that was for witchcraft. And that was kind of when we saw a little bit of reduction in some of even the literature, because some of that got kind of driven underground. And it was a few years later before it made its rebirth, if you will. So even though it may not hold any medical water, it is going to generate a fascinating web of stories, and that's going to point to that universal connection with the plant world, and it's going right back to what those Native Americans believed in that cycle of life. And kind of how that plays together here is that doctrine of signatures making its way here, specifically from the old world to the new world. And this is just kind of utilizing plants. They were the facilitation of using these plants here in the Appalachian region. So again, as we move through some of the next few slides, just think about different plants and the clues that they give you. So if we see a succulent plant, that's going to tell us that oftentimes that may thrive in a sandier soil, or it's going to withstand periods of drought. If we come across a thorny plant, basically what they're doing is that's a defense mechanism, and they're really selective about who can access its fruits. Or it goes back to how much you can take. If the harvest is easy and you don't have no trouble filling your bucket, it's all good. When that plant starts giving up fruit or saying, no, you can't have it, and it starts clinging to it, then that means that plant thinks you have enough, in essence. Notice there too, dark red or any kind of bad smelling flower. Then we know that those plants are going to rely on some kind of carrion feeding insect to distribute seeds. a different kind of signatures, and we're going to hit on all these tonight. And there's going to be different ones that we're going to talk about at different times, because again, we're just kind of creating that web. But some of the more specific signatures are going to be the environment and the habitat. Where is that plant growing? What's it native to? What region or where? What color is that plant? And we don't just mean when it's living and growing. We know that some plants are going to yield a different color dye, or a different color when they're decocted. If you go back to, I think, one of our June classes, we talked about making infusions and creating tinctures and things like that. So some of these plants will change color. The shape and the physical form, kind of like the Scorpius plant we just looked at, that's also going to be a signature. The texture and how it feels, the scent, and not necessarily just putting your nose down in it and sniffing it, but even just around you, the smell that it gives off. And then the sound and the spirit. Sometimes those are intermingled. Oftentimes when we talk about spirit, you've probably heard spirit animal or spirit signature with Native Americans. So oftentimes that'll get lumped in with sound. But basically, we're just going to look at what Mother Nature is telling us via the plants. And this is a good place to explore some of this in the Southern Appalachians. And on this slide in your PowerPoint presentation are all the links to all the research that I did for tonight's class. So there's going to be a lot of information packed in there. And I've also put a couple of different Native American, I think they're both specifically to the Cherokee, on the plants. There's a lot of historical origins and the uses that they use for, and kind of how it's how it's used in modern pharmacopoeia as well too, if that interests you, because both of those are kind of long. But as we get started, remember that although modern medicine rejects that doctrine of signatures, scientific research kind of tends to validate it unintentionally. Doesn't mean to, it just kind of happens. So, when we talk about modern science, we're picking apart herbs, we're classifying those down to each chemical component that's present in the plant. That's kind of why I started off the month talking about the phytochemical properties, trying to get you familiar with alkaloids and glycosides and tannins and all those type chemical components in the plant. Because from the scientific realm, that's what they're looking at, are all these constituents in the plant. But this plant here, we've got two different species here. This should be maybe one of the first clues when we look at the name, Equus. If you think about horses, equine, all of those are stemming back to the same Latin word. So as it turns out, this plant is more commonly called horsetail. And we know that horsetail contains a large amount of silica. And we know through modern science that silica is really beneficial to what? Our hair, right? Also good for our skin and nails and bones. But it's going to help you grow your hair long and strong. It's going to look like a beautiful horse's tail. Some people probably don't like that analogy, but it's kind of cool to think about it. Another thing to keep in mind too, because we can have multiple signatures with each plant. Horsetail is going to be one of those that grows pretty well in a wet area. So anytime we're looking at that environment, then we know that a lot of kidney remedies are going to grow in those wet areas. And in fact, horsetail was one of those that they used for that. Along with that, nettles, stinging nettles is going to be another one that grows in wet areas. And it actually has an affinity for waterways in the body. So think about any type of blood-related ailment or urinary tract. And you've heard me talk about nettles before, how it's considered a blood builder. Another thing, when we're talking about location, think about where that plant specifically grows. Is it growing really close to you and in your environment, or as far away from you as it can manage? So think about these plants that you see here, plantain or dandelion. They pretty much grow on your doorstep, right? They're growing in your front yard. So that means that you can actually use these plants for a long period of time, and you can use those safely. Whereas if we think about those plants that are far away, that we have to climb to 4,500 foot, 5,000 foot to even be able to see these plants, or at a specific time of year, any of those plants growing in the deep woods, Goldenseal, I think that was the first one I showed you, blue cohosh, they're going to have a more specialized use, and you're only going to use those for a short period of time. It's not going to be something you're using all the time. And then you've got these plants like Queen Anne's lace and chicory that you see here, or think about St. John's wort and yarrow. Those plants are kind of meeting in the middle. They're growing in the fields and the pastures. They're kind of equidistant from your doorstep to the far woods. We're going to use those for a little while, but only during a special season or a certain period of time. So location, according to the doctrine, and even with our Native Americans, ancestors and our early settlers, this was a huge belief system. So even when you go back, even in the Smokies and Cades Cove or Cataloochia, and you see some of these plants and their placement, their native location, you won't see the Goldenseals and all those really close to the house, but you'll see a lot of that plantain, because remember, that was one that came from the Old World, and the Native Americans actually said that it was white man's footsteps because it would spring forth everywhere he trod. Black cohosh, that's going to be one of our woodland forest dwellers. And you've heard me talk about this one quite a bit. And there's a lot of different names for this. I grew up calling it skunk root because it smells kind of skunky. It's got a really weird odor to it when it's blooming like this. So that's one reason it has the name Mugwort as too. And remember, wart or wort, W-O-R-T, that means herb. That's the Old English word for herb. But this plant also has another name, which is squall root. Now, if you are familiar with the area, then you know squall root is the little parasite, and I should have put a picture up here to show you that. But what we call squall root is often seen growing on the forest floor, and it's grows in an acidic environment on oak trees, more specifically. Looks like little brown pine trees. But back in the Native American times, they called this squall root because it was used to cure any female ailment. So you've heard me talk about that several times. Back in the early 1900s, the settlers used this as a concoction, though, for all kinds of things, from fever to rash. Yellow fever was a big one. And then they also used this for, well, we're going back to the signatures again. So not only is the location important, but think about the sound. And I was talking about that a few minutes ago, or the spirit. So from this picture, we know that, well, let's see if you can see here. I don't know if you can see these little seed pods. When the seed pods get a little bit dried, and you can see how many there are, I just couldn't find a good enough picture of all these. But when the wind blows a little bit, they actually kind of sound like a rattle. Okay, so that's what the Native Americans deemed a spirit signature, because it actually brought the mind of a rattlesnake, which was another reason they called it snake root, because this was the one plant they thought could cure a snake bite. In addition, this is false indigo or baptisia, and this is another one that Native Americans thought was representative of snake bite. So think back to the black cohosh. It's got that long stem and it kind of looks like a snake. This one doesn't really look like a snake, right? But it does personify necrosis. So anytime that the seed pods start drying back, they completely turn a shade of black. I don't know if you've ever seen those, but they go from the really nice green seed pod to dark black. And that represents necrosis when you've been bitten by a snake. So this is another plant that they use pretty extensively for that purpose. Here's another one some of you may be familiar with. This is what we call Eyebrite or Eyewort. It's Euphrasia officinalis, but you can kind of see it does kind of look like blinking eyes with the long eyelashes. But this is a plant remedy for modern day conjunctivitis, pink eye, any kind of eye ailment. And you'll find this actually still in use today in natural food stores and things like that. Black walnut, this is one that we're all pretty familiar with. And the cool thing about walnuts is that they resemble a human brain. So we know traditionally that walnuts were considered a medical treatment for any kind of head-related ailment. There's a lot of documentation to prove that. But today, when we look at science, it tells us that the fatty acids that are contained in walnuts are actually really good for concentration and memory of our brains. Pretty cool relationship. This is one that we call autumn crocus or fall crocus. Some people call this naked ladies. Just kind of depends on what area or region you're from. That's why I'm putting the Latin down here, so we'll always know which species I'm definitely talking about. But anyway, the roots of this plant, and I didn't show you a picture of the roots, but they actually resemble a gout-ridden toe. And so there's a lot of alkaloids actually in the naked ladies, and that is used. It's actually a constituent, an alkaloid from that plant that they use in traditional gout treatment today. This is Mullen. This is one you've heard me talk about quite a bit. And this was one that was really favored by the Native Americans. They used it all the time for a variety of ailments. And it's one that reseeded itself pretty profusely. But the biggest thing about the Mullen was the leaf location. It was really good for toilet paper. It was soft, so that goes to how that felt in the touch. And plus it was a biennial, so you were always in a constant supply because it was biennial and it reseeded itself each year. This one is fever wort. It's a triosteum, and this was actually used, just as the name says, it was used to treat fever. They would use the leaves and the flowers to make a tea, and this is one that you can still purchase today in health food stores. You've heard me talk about sumac before. Not only is it a great wildlife food, and we're actually starting to see the drupes of this right now, but it is native to the U.S., but it was also native to Europe. There's all kinds of different species. This is in the rue family, and we know we've got poisonous and non-poisonous, but this one specifically was utilized. This is rue glabra, by the way. This was used in a lot of cooking, and it's still extensively used in cooking today because you're going to get a really nice lemony tang as well as a lovely burst of color. And it's really high in vitamin C, so Native Americans knew that this was one plant that could help with scurvy, even though scurvy hadn't really been termed a thing. They knew there was something going on that was causing this major issue, and they discovered that sumac was what was healing and curing all of those ailments. But it's used for a treatment of all kinds of different things, from dysentery, diarrhea, toothaches, all kinds of things. A lot of sumac recipes, just to remind you. We talked about ginseng quite a bit, and we know that when we look at the Chinese word, it actually means man root or man essence, and the genus Panax actually means panacea, or it's a cure-all. So a lot of your Native Americans, when they first saw this plant, they knew that it was easy to divine because it looks like a man, and therefore it's going to strengthen all parts of the body. And we all know what ginseng is touted for and how much that dried root actually goes for in lots of locations around the world. Hepatica, this is another one you've heard me mention before, but Hepatica, we know looking at that Latin that it's going to have something to do with the liver. Hepatitis, think about that kind of thing. But this is the chief signatures because it does look like a liver. This is one that a lot of folks would get excited about, ecologists, early herbalists, botanists back in the day, because this is a saxifrage, and what they were known for is growing right where you see it on this picture. Okay, so any plant that could grow on a rock like this with no soil, not much to really thrive in, they knew was going to be a healing plant for this. Some of you may have had this before. I myself have had it. It's kidney stones. It's a very painful thing, but if you notice there, those kidney stones kind of look like rocks. So the signature here is that any plant that is strong enough to actually bust up rock when it grows, then it's going to be strong enough to break up any kind of stone in your system. So this was the biggie for any kind of kidney ailment or any kind of stone ailment, but more specifically kidney stones. This one here, you're probably seeing this one bloom now. This is our boneset. It's a eupatorium, so it's going to be very similar to our Joe pieweed. But sometimes this is going to also be called thorough wart, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But the signature of boneset is just how these two opposite leaves kind of fuse together, but then they kind of fuse around that stem, kind of like you would fuse a broken bone back together. But even though we don't have a lot of literature that tells us in the past this was used for broken bones. There is some, but not a lot. The biggest thing was using this for dengue fever or breakbone fever, which was what it was called. Because if you ever got that disease, which was a mosquito-borne illness, it would cause you just to ache really bad, like the flu, a lot of bone and joint pain. But not only that, as the settlers started migrating into the area, they discovered that it was like a cure-all for the common cold. So there was pretty much nowhere that there wasn't a patch of this bone set growing. And this was probably the plant that was utilized more frequently than any other plants in the Southern Appalachians, which I kind of found interesting. But I actually cited that out of a couple of different documentation, a few different materials and resources. So it's been said to be hanging from the barn rafters or in the attic, hanging from a clothesline outside, in the shed, in the spring house, wherever, anywhere that they would be working out, that they would have some of that as an easy access for any kind of ailment or any type of, like I say, common cold. And it was called thoroughwort because, again, it was for the entire body. So that's why they love that plant so much. This is our common milkweed, the Esclespeus, and let me get that other picture. You'll notice there that sap. This is what's very indicative of the milkweed. The biggest use for this was actually to stimulate milk production in new mothers. So it was after childbirth, they would actually take the sap and create a concoction and give that to the mothers to increase that flow of milk. The leaves have also been used as a female contraceptive, believe it or not, by the Native Americans. And you get a lot of questions on that probably because the monarchs, they actually use it to reproduce. And then it's also said that the monarchs would become toxic to predators when they actually fed on this sap as well. So kind of a flip-flop with the butterflies and humans, but a lot of different uses for the common milkweed. And if you look at this, we're going to talk about this in the next slide, you can kind of see what that resembles. And that was actually utilized in preparing wounds or treating wounds. It's like a gauze dressing, and you can kind of see why it was used. That kind of looks like a modern day roll of gauze. But this is a plant too that has been used in lots of different countries around the world, and at least all parts of the plant are usable, but oftentimes for different things. So as you see here, I don't know if you can see that written there, it's milkweed pods collected locally, and these are just mesh bags full of the milkweed pods because they would use that in World War II for pillow stuffing and then in life preservers. And then in some places, milkweed pods are still worth about 55 cents a pound. This is yarrow. This is also a plant that we call nosebleed or blood stop because it was used as a blood stopping agent. The Native Americans would just take those leaves and flowers. They could be fresh or dried, and they would apply that to a bleeding wound, and it would seal that wound in just seconds. The biggest thing was there, and still is, if you utilize it, is to just make sure that wound is clean before applying a topical use. Then we have Jack in the Pulpit, and there's a big story on the Jack in the Pulpit. It's got a lot of different names, a lot of different legends associated with this plant, but I wanted to make sure that I mentioned it at least so you can go back and look at some of those stories. But this is actually the Jack that's sitting in the pulpit here. Lots of different notions of how it got its name, but the big takeaway from this plant is just to know that it is kind of toxic. It has a lot of oxalic crystals, so if you touch the root of this plant, it is going to sting. And we had Native Americans that actually said that they would wet their hands with that milky juice of the plant, and it would help them be able to basically wrestle rattlesnakes. It would help kill snakes. It would prevent them. It provided a shield for them not to be bitten. So again, lots of stories in there about this one. So if you're interested in this plant, make sure you check it out because this is when we don't want folks poaching in our national forests and our national parks and everything, but it is an edible plant, even though it has high amounts of oxalic acid. It was utilized pretty creatively by the Native Americans. This one here is bloodroot. Go ahead and pop that picture up there because you can see where it gets its name. And of course, the Latin is sanguinaria, which means blood. Interestingly enough, when we go back to the signatures for color, when you dry this root, it's going to turn yellow. It's going to look a lot like Goldenseal. So we know that this is going to be a use for any kind of blood issue in the body. Specifically rheumatism was what the Native Americans used that for. But then they would also use it in the dried form to help with like liver diseases and things like that, because that color was associated with the liver. This is burdock. Many of you have heard me mention this one before. It really helps in the case of bloating, and that was a biggie that the Native Americans used it for as well. But they used it as a food source. And the Europeans found a use for rheumatism for this. And that was their biggest use, but they would drink, they would dig up the roots because this is a biennial plant, but it also reseeds very prolifically. But they would dig up the root and use that as a tea and drink that for rheumatism. This is catnip or catmint. So we know that this one's been used as a tranquilizer, a sedative, a digestive aid, a painkiller, all kinds of different uses, or just to drive our cats crazy. But catnip actually grew wild, and it quickly spread anywhere because it is in the mint family. But it was pretty well used for pneumonia, colds, fevers, and all that. And the Cherokee, this is another one that they love because they said it actually helped promote digestion. So a lot of plants in the mint family do, in fact, do that. And this was a big one that they used for toothache. And I don't know if you can kind of see the blooms here. The reason for that's because they looked like teeth, according to Native Americans. Comfrey's one you've heard me mention several times. It's been acclaimed as the great healer. That's why it earned the name nip bones. This is a plant that has been around since before Christ, 400 BC. The Greeks used this one to stop bleeding, to treat any type of bronchial problem. And we know that if we look at that Latin, it actually means coming together. But one of the big things that the Native Americans discovered was the root. And you can barely see this root down here. I couldn't find a picture to show you what the roots look like when you cook that root. But the root system is pretty extensive, and what they would do was cook it, and it was like glue. And so they used it for broken bones and mending any type of cuts. Again, you just didn't want to seal any kind of infection in. But it very mucilaginous, kind of looks like the marshmallow plant. But this was a huge food source as well, because not just for livestock, but also for humans, because of the amounts of vitamins and minerals that was in that. When we look at the signatures for stems and roots, we got to look at the allium family. So I just put a lot of pictures up here of those. Anything that's going to have a hollow stem, that's going to help clean any type of tubes in the body. So think about your bronchial tubes, your alimentary tract. And we've already talked about some of those. Comfrey, onions are going to be a big one for that. Irish moss, if you're familiar with that. Another good indicator when we look at stems and roots is to look at that root system. Are they really, really deep, kind of like the comfrey, or are they really fibrous and thin, kind of like the cleavers that you see here? Because that's going to tell you too. If it's got a very fine and meshed root system, then that's going to tell us it's used for the nervous system. Valerian is going to be another one of that, or even lady slippers. And then we'll talk about caneberries here, anything in the rubus family, all kinds of different species that are going to exist in there. But it goes back to the thorns. If it's edible, it's evolved with those thorns just to protect itself. It's just the defense mechanism. But one of the biggest things that brambles or caneberries are going to be used for is for sharp pain, because that thorn also is indicative of relieving pain. They can be used interchangeably as a food source and as a nutritive. So it's going to be used pretty frequently in teas. And then blackberry is also going to be astringent, which means it's going to have a little zing to it. It's going to be really mild in action, how it acts, but it's going to be very powerful at the same time for any type of dysentery or loose bowel diarrhea type syndrome. But the big thing from that is the thorns. So if you think about a lot of our modern day varieties, they don't have those thorns. They don't have that defense mechanism built in. So that kind of showcases a little bit of the science behind that too. Flavor is going to have a big effect on the signatures. So remember this as we move through the next few slides in regard to it being sour, bitter, sweet, spicy, or salty. Because if we have a sour tasting herb, those have been said to stop any kind of secretions. It's going to help tissue contract, and it's going to promote digestion or any type of liver, like a fatty liver issue. So this one here is going to be Hawthornberry. It's often used for heart conditions. And then, believe it or not, the Chinese dogwood is also going to be utilized in some of those. We've talked a lot about bitter tasting herbs. That was actually one of those phytochemical properties we talked about not long ago. But anytime that it's a bitter tasting herb, then it's going to have a cooling and an anti-inflammatory, even an antiviral effect on the body. It can even help remove parasites from the body. So they're going to help improve stomach function. They're going to help clean the blood, even clear cholesterol from the veins. So some of the most popular would be Goldenseal. And then we have what we call Mugwort, which is a species of the Artemisia. If we get a sweet tasting herb, we know that those are going to be very building and nourishing. So again, we're going to use ginseng as an example there. Any food that's going to contain complex carbohydrates and any type of protein and sugar, then they're going to help build the body. So ginseng, again, that means it's man's herb. It's healing the whole body. And just to kind of throw in a few foods there, bell peppers and cinnamon, these are what we would term a spicy food. So they're going to be very drying. They're going to be very warming to the body. So they're going to be helpful for any kind of sinus, allergies, any kind of congestion, arthritis, colds, flus. They're going to help relieve any type of bruising injury. And then last, I don't have a picture up here, but salty herbs are going to be cooling. And they're actually going to help moisten the body because of the way they help organs retain water. So that's that's an issue that a lot of us females complain about all the time, but they really do have a place in this intricate web. And any type of algae and kelp would be an example of a salty tasting herb. Just to make mention, I've talked about St. John's wort before, but if we look at St. John's wort, it probably elicits a happy feeling. And the reason for that is because it is yellow, which often correlates to being happy. But then it also grows in an environment where it lacks full sun. And so when we look at the properties of St. John's wort, it's known as the Prozac of Europe, because it is in fact native to Europe, but it is one of those plants that was brought early on by the early colonists and used here. Already mentioned witch hazel a little while ago, but our native species, the Hamamelis virginiana, is what they would often use for dowsing rods. And that was basically to find sources of underground water. And then we know today that witch hazel is still used in a lot of toners and bath and body products. And it's also going to be one that's really good for poison ivy, any kind of skin rash or anything like that. And just to throw mayapple in here, y'all know this is one of my favorite plants, not just because I love it growing in my shade garden under the rocks, but because research has really come a long way. So it just kind of is one of those plants that helps us synthesize, I guess, modern day pharmacopoeia, just how far we really have come in terms of research, because this is being used in anti-cancer research or anti-tumor development research. It's being utilized in chemotherapy infusions today. It is a pretty toxic plant. You know, this is one thing you don't want to pick the fruit when it's still green. We want to wait till it's ripe. I talked about that a little bit last week, but it does make a really tasty jelly. And one of the first uses for it was for warts, warts on your hands or plantar warts on your feet, any type of papilloma, which kind of helps steer it in the direction for cancer treatments, and used as a laxative. Before we wrap up tonight, and I may go over just a little bit tonight, so if y'all need to like jump off here, that's okay. I understand, but I've got just a few more slides to go through. But one thing I want to just draw your brain to really focus on, I guess, is paying attention to the folk names. Now, that might sound kind of backwards to what I'm always telling you. Look at that Latin name. But as you can probably tell from tonight, there's a lot of clues in the Latin name, the taxonomy of those plants from years and years ago. But also those folk names are going to tell you, because that's going to be specific to the region, and that's going to differ. So you've heard me kind of randomly hit on some of those tonight. So you're going to notice that plants are going to have a lot of different common names, but the old timers would name these plants specifically for a reason. And again, I've already mentioned some of those tonight, but Eyebrite, it got its name because it helps the eyes. Liverwort, because it helps the liver. When we look at this plant, this is called pukeweed, believe it or not. Yeah, you heard me right. Pukeweed, like that, throwing up. Also called asthma weed, but this is our native lobelia or Indian tobacco. So, during August and September right now, you're going to see this one blooming. It's pretty delicate. It's not a big standout. It is going to have hollow stems. So remember, hollow stems are going to have to do with your airways. But this is one that's used, or actually gives us lobeline, which is going to be one of those alkaloids that's used in a lot of respiratory ailments. So if you've ever had bronchitis or emphysema, COPD, lobeline is actually going to be one of those alkaloids used in that medication. And interestingly enough, it's a smoking cessation plant as well. You've heard me mention this one several times, but it goes back to the naming. Butterfly weed. I've told you before, I didn't know what everybody called butterfly weed. I thought that's what everybody called butterfly bush. But the Native Americans actually called this Floorsy root because it did in fact help with any of those lung issues and ailments. This is a plant that we call hill-all in the Southern Appalachians. Sometimes you'll hear it called horsebalm or richweed. It is a member of the mint family, but it's called hill-all because it was a hill-all. So boneset was one that they used pretty frequently, but hill-all was one that, because it was in the mint family, it grew everywhere. So it was one, if they didn't have access to some of those other more popular plants, they could just grab hill-all, and it truly was their hill-all. From hill-all, we moved to self-heal, or also sometimes called hill-all. A little bit different species. This one is lower growing on the ground, and this is one that we're actually seeing bloom right now. But it too has pretty tremendous healing properties. It was known to cure any kind of inflammation, tension headaches, edema, anything like that. And it was also called heart of the earth. This was the herb that was known as heart of the earth. Goldenrod, this is another one you've heard me mention several times. It was one that the Native Americans would call woundwort. And the reason for that is because it was a true wound healer. And they actually used this as a food source when times were lean. And I had that picture in there just to remind you, pollen's too sticky, it can't float by wind. Don't blame goldenrod. This is one you want to plant. This is the bad guy, the ragweed. So a lot of people get those confused, but just remember, goldenrod can't be, pollen can't spread. You heard me talk about yarrow a few minutes ago, but one of the common names is bloodstock or nosebleed. Lots of different species of the Achille, but that's its most common use. If you are familiar with wild yam, the Native Americans and the early settlers called this colic root. Pretty self-explanatory, and a lot of these are. Here's the bone set. Again, it wasn't for broken bones. Again, this is for breakbone fever or the dengue fever. Feverwort. This is also called centauri or centauri. I'm not sure how you say that. I had never heard that word for this plant before, but feverwort was actually a blood purifier, and it was used to break fever, and it is a bitter herb. So it also helped stimulate the appetite and improve digestion. This is pilewort, P-I-L-E, also called buttercup. It's also called small celandine, if you're familiar with celandine poppy. Also called lesser crowfoot and dusky maiden. This is one, though, it is in the, you can see ranunculus is in that buttercup family, so it is a low grower to the ground. But this is one that's very invasive now, and it is, if ingested, it's poisonous. If it's raw, it can be fatal to grazing livestock, even sheep. It doesn't have to be a rumen for it to be caustic, but a lot of U.S. states have actually banned this or listed it as a noxious weed. And one of the worst things about it is as those, or as the fruit mature, that's when the leaves turn poisonous. So kind of like a cherry tree. The leaves consumed raw or cooked as a pot herb in the spring, though, by Native American cultures, and then the colonists that came a little bit later. This plant is Inulin, or better known as scabwort. So the unfortunate thing is that it, depending on what region of the Appalachians you were in, this was also called horseheel, which would sometimes get a little bit confused with horsetail and some of those other horse plants. But this is the elecampane, sometimes also called yellow head or wild sunflower. But the scabwort was in fact used to help stop bleeding. This one here is called mouthwort, and as you might imagine, it was used for any kind of mouth issue. This is going to be considered a spring ephemeral. It is going to bloom pretty early in the season, but sometimes you'll hear this plant, depending on, again, on what region you're in, golden thread or golden root. Sometimes it's called yellow snake root. This is probably one of my favorites because we just don't think about this one maybe as much, but this one is a viola, but it's called heart ease. This is one by the signature doctrines. The Native Americans called this, and then the early settlers called it heart ease because it was considered a tonic for the heart. So this is going to be our Johnny Jump Ups, or our wild pansy, also called Come and Cuddle Me or Faces in the Hood. It's got a lot of different names depending on what region of the Appalachians you're in. Again, this is going to be a type of saxifrage, so anything that's going to grow on that rock is going to have some kind of kidney function. So this is called kidney wort. And this one is lung moss, so it is going to be some kind of parasitic lichen. It's going to also have some algae characteristics, but as you might imagine, it's going to be used for any kind of lung issue. This one is skullcap. This is Scutellaria. It's great for headaches, as you might imagine, still used pretty prolifically in the mountains today. It too is also going to be a plant in the mint family. And this one is pretty simple. It's kind of an ugly plant, but it's just simply called the cough herb. And you can probably tell from its Latin name, Tussilago, because if you buy Tussin, Robitussin cough syrup, or the generic Tussin, then we know that that's going to be a cough medicine. The other name for this plant is colt's foot, and it is a member of the aster family, like you can probably tell there. But the reason it was called colt's foot, and I'm not sure what that has to do with quitting or smoking cessation, but that's another reason that it got its name. So it was pretty frequently used in the old world before making it here. Okay, so with that, I actually landed right on an hour and 2 minutes, so that's not too bad, y'all. But I hope that kind of maybe brought together the last few weeks and kind of honed it down just here in the Appalachians, and kind of when we do talk about all that immersion of culture coming from the different areas in the world, how that came to be, and just how, you know, it didn't come from this one place or it didn't come from this one place. You know, it came from just a culmination of all of that together. And I think that's what makes it so special. And it doesn't really matter what part of the Appalachians, or even if we're not in the Appalachians where we live, it's just cool to think about all of that network of how everything kind of came to be and how you can see that evolving even just in the last 20 or 30 years. So anyway, if y'all have questions about any of that stuff, because it's a lot of information to try to present in an hour, don't hesitate to reach out. There is the PowerPoints. There's two different ones in the Google Drive already. There's one with notes on the page, or then it's in the Adobe where you just click on it and read through. And like I say, if you're interested in a lot of those, make sure you click on those links, because there's a lot of good handy information in there too. Remember, next Monday, we're not going to meet. going to Crossville for the Fall Gardeners Festival. And in September, we're going to be off that month, and we'll come back in October. And I really don't remember what the first October is that we'll be meeting, but don't worry, you'll be getting an email from me. So you'll be able to sign up for those classes. So I enjoyed it, y'all, and we will see you when the leaves start to fall.
Thanks, Melody.
Thanks, y'all.